As mentioned, I have the coolest job title in North America. I'm not biased or anything, but I'm so excited to talk to you all about our policy here in San Antonio and not only like the ordinance itself that we have, but kind of how we got there and all of the different like tools and strategies that we've kind of like stacked together to ultimately get to a regulation. Because I know that in a lot of communities, the idea of implementing a policy can be really scary or like a non-starter in certain areas. I will say right off the bat, one of my phrases is if we can do it in Texas, you can do it anywhere. But hopefully by sharing where we've been and where we're going, it'll kind of illustrate more how we've managed to achieve what we're doing and help you do the same. So, oh, why isn't it moving? Okay, here's like the star of our program, I would say. So we have this ordinance. It was adopted in September of 2022. So it's been over a year now. And basically what it says is that San Antonio's oldest small scale housing stock is now required to be deconstructed. So you're able to see the current phase that we're in right now. So basically any residential structure, fourplex or smaller down to single family is required to be deconstructed currently and built in 1920 anywhere in the city or 1945 in historic districts or neighborhood conservation districts. And then in January 1 of 2025, that's actually going to expand automatically and go to 1945 or earlier citywide anywhere, and then 1960 in those protected districts. But we didn't get there overnight. So I always like to share this Facebook post. Many of you may know Shannon Miller. She's the director of our office. And she posted this on November 3rd of 2016, over 7 years ago. And basically she was resharing an article that covered how Portland, Oregon was the first city in not only the United States, but in North America to mandate a deconstruction ordinance. And she said, this is on my list for San Antonio. Let's do it in 2017. It makes sense for so many reasons. Spoiler alert, we did not do this in 2017, but we did launch our initiative in 2017, not only because of the leadership and the vision of Shannon, but because of this. Our city council actually directed our office in 2017 to start looking at all of the policies that we had on the books related to traditional demolition due to community outcry. San Antonio is one of the largest cities in the United States. It's the 7th largest city, and it's one of the fastest growing cities consistently in the country. So the pace and the locations of these demolitions were concerning to the community. And basically we got directive to kind of explore alternatives to that, including a deconstruction policy. So that's what we worked towards, but it wasn't always necessarily the end goal. And now, as a result of that policy, you're seeing more and more as an alternative to what you just saw on the previous slide, this kind of work happening. And I always like to make it known, especially to audiences like this, we view deconstruction as a demolition alternative, not as a preservation alternative. So all of the buildings that are ultimately deconstructed in San Antonio were already approved for removal through our existing preservation ordinance or, unified development code. So it's not about if a building comes down, but rather how that building comes down after that decision is made. And you can just see, like from this image, how different that is. You don't see a cloud of dust, you don't see splinters of materials, but rather you see that intentional work being done by actual humans, resulting in an amazing array of recoverable, reusable building materials. And some latest stats of that impact, we've had 47 projects that have fallen under this ordinance and counting. So that includes both projects that have been completed and those that are kind of in our permit pipeline in different stages. We've diverted over 35,000 pounds of waste from the landfill, largely for reuse. And then we're averaging around a 60% diversion rate across all projects. Projects are different. I lovingly refer to some houses in San Antonio as Frankenstein houses, where you'll have like an original 1920s home that has been added onto and adapted over time. So some of those projects that have been, altered significantly may have a lower diversion rate, but then we're able to like inch up to that closer diversion rate with really beautiful projects like the one that you saw on the prior slide that really yield sometimes up to 85 to 90% of the materials can be diverted from the landfill through deconstruction. And that initiative, when it started, one of the first steps that we took back in 2018, after we got that directive from City Council, was to establish a deconstruction advisory committee. And you have that list of, companies and names on the side, just to give an example of kind of the breadth of the people that we brought together, talking about breaking down silos. That's exactly what we wanted to do from the jump. So it includes everyone from our real estate council, which is basically like a coalition of very strong and powerful and developers that have a lot of money, to community advocates, our conservation society, local architects and designers, environmental advocates, educators, what have you. So the mind map, the little hexagons you see on the left, is something that we produced very early on with our deconstruction advisory committee, just to kind of visualize all of the different disciplines that this topic touched specifically for San Antonio. So there are some gimmies that you see, like waste reduction, sustainability, of course, but then from the go, because the Office of Historic Preservation was leading this effort, cultural and historic preservation was a huge priority, but things like public health, equity and affordable housing, workforce prosperity and innovation were kind of cornerstones of how we wanted to craft a hyperlocal policy that addressed and advanced kind of the efforts around this work in the city. And I think the term hyperlocal is really important when we're talking about deconstruction policies specifically, just because there isn't a federal, guideline or mandate or regulation around deconstruction yet. Hopefully we'll get there soon. But in the absence of either state or federal leadership around this kind of work, it really falls to the communities and the cities that are advancing these policies to kind of craft something that really makes sense for them. And these examples on the screen are kind of different things that vary across cities drastically sometimes. So what is your political climate? Do you have a state that mirrors your local political climate, right? Like, I very frankly talk about how San Antonio is in Texas, which is not a very environmentally friendly regulation state. So we kind of have to work within our own legal structures and not rely on kind of the vision of our state, as you might find in other states like California or Washington or Oregon, or those along the East Coast. And then other elements like primary demolition driver, who is the person or the organization that is most commonly requesting building demolition in your city? And this is really important because in cities like San Antonio, overwhelmingly, we're getting requests for demolition by private property owners. But if you're in a Rust Belt city or a city that experienced a big population boom in the early 20th century and then rapid population decline, like Milwaukee, my hometown, Detroit, St. Louis, Baltimore, you may actually find that the city itself is demolishing most of the buildings. So that comes into play when we're talking about how policies are crafted, because that identifies, what kind of stakeholders need to be in the room when you're talking about how to move deconstruction forward. So hyperlocal is definitely key. And then we've kind of reflected on how we've gotten to the point of an actual regulation in a city like San Antonio. And this is kind of like a simplified framework of all of the steps that we've taken. We kind of brand it as like a little toolkit for other communities. But the bottom one you see right here, place-based policies, we're talking about an ordinance, right? But then there are these 5 other big categories of things that we looked at and did that we were did working to develop a policy, including pulling data, telling stories with data, developing a workforce, focusing on community engagement, looking at how materials are flowing in our city, like how people can access reclaimed building materials. So looking at those kind of considerations. And then of course, my favorite thing is developing interdisciplinary networks and partnerships, because for a policy like this to succeed anywhere, it can't just be one entity or one person doing that work, because in effect, we are trying to kind of challenge the overarching linear economy in our cities, which makes it really easy to throw things away. And we're talking about reusing a really challenging material, which are building materials. They're huge, they're cumbersome, they're complicated. So we really have to work together to kind of forge this entire reuse ecosystem. And then on the right are four categories of actions that we've engaged with that I think other communities can adopt or explore. So physical, policy, planning, and community. Physical, we mean like a hands-on event, like workforce training or a demonstration project. Policy can be regulatory or non-regulatory, like an incentive. Um, Planning action includes a deconstruction advisory committee or a partnership with a research institution or a nonprofit. And then a community action is like a community-based project. And I will go through examples of all of these as kind of the framework of this presentation. And again, simplified, I like graphics. But at the very top, you see this is the color for place-based policies. And I kind of like this like pyramid like visualization because we kind of use those other elements as the grounding, the foundation for finally getting to a policy, if that makes sense. So you'll see kind of these little icons in the corner that showcase what I'm kind of referring to that refer back to our toolkit. But one of the first things that we did was look at data. Data is really, really key to kind of understanding why deconstruction is important for your community or maybe with this scale of demolition. So we looked at demolition permits for over a decade and kind of pulled those numbers. And this is the same data set, just visualized differently. So right here, we have this line that marks 2018 is when we formalized our Deconstruction Advisory Committee. And in San Antonio, we're averaging around 450 demolitions a year. That's all building types. And then, it only increased, right? Because of how fast San Antonio is growing, we're now averaging between 600 to 650 demolitions a year. So really just illustrating that the problem isn't going away. It's not ameliorating itself on its own. So it's important for us to take action from a policy perspective. And then this is perhaps even more important to us is actually mapping where those demolitions are happening. I always say that demolition doesn't just happen to buildings, it happens to people, it happens to communities, and it's really important to know which communities are affected by that practice. And you'll see here in our near west side and our near east side is where a lot of those demolitions are occurring. And the most commonly demolished building in San Antonio is single family housing. And these are, our formerly redlined communities, are traditionally excluded communities. They have been under-resourced by institutions like the ones I've worked for in the past, the city. But just because they're not protected by a historic district or a neighborhood conservation district, that's what these polygons are, doesn't mean that the material and like the housing stock isn't valuable, right? So these were actually one of our most active communities in pushing for a deconstruction ordinance because they understand that without these protective overlays, they're more susceptible to demolition, but that doesn't mean that they have to lose their building stock by smashing it and throwing it away. They can actually recover some of the materials for use in their own communities. So the community has always been a huge driver of what this policy looks like from day one. This is another way of visualizing data. This is actually an exact slide that we showed our city council when we were voting on the deconstruction ordinance in 2022. So this basically summarizes 4 key reasons why deconstruction policy is really needed in San Antonio. So something that we did before we brought the ordinance to vote is we commissioned a study called Treasure in the Walls. It's at this link here if anyone's interested in reading it, that looked at what a deconstruction policy would do for San Antonio economically, environmentally, culturally, socially, what have you. It basically was like a strategic plan for deconstruction. And we wanted to put a dollar value to the amount of materials that we were throwing away through this linear practice. $16 million in the past decade. That's insane. So really kind of getting to those people that are numbers based and understanding that we're literally throwing away resources that could be used in our own city. I mentioned, how we're up to over 600 buildings demolished annually. And something that's really key with data is that we were able to illustrate that this is a 70% increase since 2012, meaning that pace is just exponential in a way, and that we need to do something to curb the reality that we're throwing away, things that are filling up our landfills and things that have value. Something else that was really key to our city council was the public health implications of demolition. Demolition is effectively air pollution, right? Like even if you're spraying down a site the way that you're supposed to with water while you're smashing it, there's going to be particulate matter that spreads 200, 400, 600 feet away from a site. Demolition doesn't happen in a bubble, but that also percolates into our groundwater. It's just not a sustainable practice. And I look forward to the day when it's something that people really look down on. So we really drilled that into our constituents. And this was like a huge point for a lot of our environmentally focused council members, was to kind of mitigate the externalities of demolition on their own communities. And then something that we're also looking at ameliorating inch by inch, as slow and steady, is equity issue and material access and availability. So limited reclaimed materials means limited access by a diverse array of stakeholders. So in a way, when we're throwing away building materials, we are robbing our own community members from being able to access those, right? And for what? For them to sit in a landfill and do nothing? Come on, that's crazy. So we really wanted to focus on how, if we got more of these materials back into San Antonio, that we could use them for a multitude of different purposes that are productive, right? And something focused on preservation, we also really wanted to look to history to demonstrate that deconstruction isn't actually new or novel. Demolition is more new, right? So demolition, the way that we know it, the way that we experience it, really wasn't a widespread thing until after World War II, which is when we brought war machines, machines of destruction, back from Europe to the United States for urban renewal. Before that, deconstruction was more prevalent, and sometimes it was referred to as wrecking. And I love newspaper archives. They're my favorite research tool. And this is just one example of San Antonio, where one of our older post office buildings that's located right across from the Alamo was deconstructed in the 1930s. And some of the granite columns and its limestone block were used to repair a building on the famous San Antonio Riverwalk. So we like to point to, not only is this a San Antonio tradition, but this is an American tradition. And it's something that we can get back to if we have the will to do it. Training a workforce, this is key. For any community that is looking to get started or dip their toes into what deconstruction can do, a workforce training, I think, is a really, really great next step. We as the city, our first deconstruction contractor training that we hosted was in 2019. So it was a year after we launched our advisory committee, but it was still years away from our actual ordinance being adopted. So you don't need a policy to pursue workforce training. And we've held a training every year since. And as the city, we are committed to hosting it indefinitely. So we subsidize this training for contractors, and we work with an amazing all-women-led nonprofit out of repurposed Savannah. We hire them to train our local contractors. And I have a fun video to show you that kind of summarizes that program.
We are here on a property on Fitzhugh Road, which is owned by the San Antonio River Authority. And we are conducting a deconstruction training program in partnership between the Office of Historic Preservation and the San Antonio River Authority's property here.
I think it's an awesome experience. I've learned a lot. As far as resalvaging wood, it's going to be beneficial to us. The tools, the knowledge that they've been sharing with us, taking us out. I never imagined we could take a roof off from the attic out. When I got up there and started doing it, I was like, wow, okay. So it's been a real experience. A lot of knowledge has been poured out, and knowledge that we could take back and use for our stores and for anybody else that's out there, that wants to do this kind of stuff.
I'm new at this, and so just working with the material, it almost has a life of itself. Like when you're trying to pull a board off, it's almost like it doesn't want to leave home. But it has to, because otherwise it's going to go in a dumpster. And we're also saving the environment by not having to cut down trees and throwing good material in the landfill.
What we see is that a portion of our materials is going right back into the buildings, and then another portion is going into craft materials and craft goods, home goods, things which will be cherished, a family table that you'll sit around for generations, heirloom items. These are really beautiful materials, and often they're best served by being accessible, touchable, visible. For folks who are interested in getting involved, there's a million ways to do so. And you don't have to swing a hammer to get involved in deconstruction. We need people at every level, working in policy, working in advocacy, education, business. Get in touch with the OHP. Your Office of Historic Preservation is going to be hosting many trainings just like this one.
I'm sorry, I just have to show like that like really sick like logo. I don't know why our communications department just like went all out for that animation, but whatever. So I want to hone in on something that a trainee said, which is when you're trying to pull a board off, it's almost like it doesn't want to leave home, but it has to because otherwise it's going to go into a dumpster. This quote like gets me every time in the feels. But I think it really illustrates kind of how deconstruction really sits between the kind of binary preservation field that I've found ourselves in, which is preservation is the win, demolition is the loss, and there's nothing in between. But in reality, there's a lot in between. So we're able to kind of train our contractors through that preservation lens, so they're understanding the material history, the material value, the cultural value of the work that they're doing. So that's why we really, really love working with Repurpose Savannah, because they really approach deconstruction as a preservation tool. And in addition to that, we have always viewed deconstruction as an extension of our legacy trades, right? It is a legacy trade in the same way that window restoration is a legacy trade, architectural carpentry. And in addition to deconstruction training, I would say that our foundation for getting that going was that for over a decade, our office has been hosting community hands-on training workshops, like window workshops over a weekend that turns into something like Rehaborama, where we're restoring 20 houses in one day with 300 community members. And then from there, we actually established a trades academy, which is now a college alternative for people looking to enter the trades field, which is so in demand. And the entire goal of this suite of programming is to not only walk the walk as a historic preservation regulatory office, right? Like we want to train people to do the work, but the more people that are in our community to do window restoration, deconstruction, carpentry, what have you, the more easy it is for that to access, the more competitive the bids are for the people that want to steward their historic buildings. So deconstruction to us is just like part of this entire ecosystem. Another question that we had to answer when we were developing our ordinance was, where is all the material going to go? If we're going to convert 30, 40, 50 houses out of the demolition pipeline into the deconstruction pipeline annually, the city should play some sort of role in, at the very minimum, providing physical laydown space for building materials temporarily, or as an outlet for building materials to be donated if people didn't want to keep them or use them or sell them. So right after our ordinance was adopted, we held our groundbreaking event for what we call the Material Innovation Center. We like to brand it as the last stop before the landfill. So if you really don't want to use any of the materials that you have, we will happily take them and divert them into, right now we're using them for affordable housing programs, trades education, and community impact projects. And the location of this center is also very important, but slightly unusual. We are leasing this giant campus that you see on the left of over 30 buildings. 25 of them are houses that were built in the early 1900s to serve as housing for generals and their families that were living and working at an active Air Force base. This is a former Air Force base. It is now decommissioned. It's now called Port San Antonio, but these gorgeous craftsman houses, these bungalows, were basically vacant for 20 years. And our office was like, hey, we know what to do with these. Can we use them for material storage? Can we use them for trades education? And the port was like, yeah, sure, why not? Okay. So this is our playground now. And the key components that this site are currently functioning as are the Material Innovation Center is what we call the arm where people can donate building materials. And then we as the city and our partners will find kind of the next use for them. The houses that you saw Our Trades Academy is actually restoring them. They're learning them, they're using them as learning labs. So they're restoring them and moving down the street, you know, after they fix up one, they'll fix up another. And then right now we're working on standing up a tool library so people can access tools for free to repair their buildings, because shockingly, San Antonio doesn't have one. So to us, it seems very natural for all of these functions to be co-located in one spot, because they're all focused on advancing reuse, access to trades, access to tools, access to the knowledge and the physical items that are needed to really retain our existing housing stock. And back to this organ donor analogy that we'll say over and over again. This is my favorite function of this center in its really early stages. We are actively receiving building materials that you see on the left. That's a picture inside one of our garages, and then connecting them to affordable housing projects. And something that I'm really proud of, that our team is really proud of, is that we're working hand in hand with the city's housing department. They do HUD-funded housing restorations and housing rehabs for deeply affordable units. And a lot of times they're houses like the ones that you see on the screen, right? They were built in 1910, 1920, 1930. And instead of having to go to Home Depot to buy like brand new virgin lumber that we as preservationists know is going to deteriorate faster and in a different way than old growth lumber, we can actually match make materials from this center to these affordable housing projects. So that is what we're actively doing right now. It is so fun, it is so cool, and it is absolutely a function that a preservation office should be doing. So we're really, really grateful that this is something that we're prototyping hand in hand with another large city department, and kind of shifting their own mindset on how to access these materials, because they can shop the center for free, right? Like, it's a no-brainer. So very, very exciting current update. And then something else that we are prototyping at this center, some of you may know of the company called Reaply, which is based out of Chicago. It's basically this asset exchange tool, this platform where you can upload excess materials and recirculate them within a confined community. So typically, this is an organization. We're actually piloting our own marketplace within the city itself. So all of the city's assets are being recirculated, like computers and mouses and desks and furniture. But then we also are building a marketplace platform connected to our center. So this is just a screen grab of some of the things that we have at the center, so people can go onto that platform and see what we have. And then what I love about Reaply is that you can see sustainability impacts in real time. So even though all of these materials are available for free to our community partners, every time a transaction happens, we're able to see these stats go up. So almost $15,000 of materials we've saved through reuse, diverted over 2,000 pounds of material, and it also calculates avoided carbon. So data, we love data. This is great. And something that I could have never dreamed of, you know, graduating from a preservation program, working on something like this. But when we're in the thick of it, it just makes so much sense that we're connecting climate and housing to preservation and reuse. Another fun thing that's happening at this campus, there are these really, really, really cute, basically ADUs that were moved from a different part of the base when it was closed to this site. And we're actually looking at duplexes right now. And to us, we are really interested in connecting our work broadly into affordable housing. So much like many cities across the country, affordable housing is like the top policy priority in San Antonio. It is the biggest priority of our mayor. So we like to, again, go back to history, our favorite thing to do, and reflect on kit houses. I'm sure most, if not all of you know what kit houses were. You used to be able to order houses from Sears or another organization and basically get prepared materials for someone to build it for you. And that is exactly what one of our research partnerships at UTSA is doing. So we're using this campus as kind of a research playground. These are pictures from a advanced architecture studio from last year, whose entire studio was focused on the idea of salvage to ADU, salvage to accessory dwelling unit. How can we reuse reclaimed materials to build new small scale affordable housing stock? So these are the students, you know, developing one-to-one models out of 100% reclaimed materials to develop structures that were stress tested, that were evaluated by engineers, and actually developed designs and prototypes that hopefully, again, we're working with our housing department, that we can get pre-permitted so that people can go to the permit center, find houses that are kit houses, and potentially source materials for free if they're qualified from the Material Innovation Center. So this is probably my favorite thing that has ever happened here, but I'm a very hyperbolic person. My next favorite thing will probably happen next week, but whatever. Another really great example of what we refer to as community impact projects. This is a team from Lake Flato Architects, which is one of my favorite architecture firms here in San Antonio. There is an event held every year nationally called Parking Day, where a large thoroughfare in downtowns that have vehicular access are closed for a full day, and it's pedestrian only. And, you know, organizations are invited to, you know, set up couches and just like little spots to really demonstrate the power of pedestrian only traffic. And last year's theme was focused on sustainability. So this team sourced material from the Material Innovation Center. You can see kind of reclaimed siding here, lumber here, to build this pavilion that they designed to be deconstructed. So they constructed it, built it, used it, and then deconstructed it, and then donated all of those materials back to our center to be reused in another way. And what I love about this is that we're starting to expand our partnership into artists. So we have a collective of artists from a Black-owned art gallery that are currently using materials from our center to design pieces for a Juneteenth event that's coming up in June. So these are the kind of partnerships that we want to prioritize, focused on things that can be used in parks, public art. So this is a really great example of like cradle to cradle, using materials from the center, designing and using it, and then donating it for another use right away. Now, something that's very exciting on this very chaotic slide. So we have been very fortunate to have some awesome architecture teams, you know, kind of explore what this campus might look like, right? If we can get like just like a buttload of cash. We've kind of looked at a master planning, how this can not only function as, you know, a center for material receivership and storage, but what if we activate this space to include restaurants and art galleries and, you know, research elements, where this is really a circular campus. And then I really love this, like this is totally AI generated, if you couldn't tell. But there's a vacant part of the campus that is just ready to be activated, and we are very hopeful that we'll get that investment soon. This site is actually entered into C40's Reinventing Cities competition for this year, which asks groups from around the world to develop a project proposal for underutilized sites that are very focused on sustainability and community impact. So if any of you are interested in developing a team to submit for the proposal, I think we're going to be getting expressions of interest in late fall. So yeah, super exciting. We're moving fast, and we're really grateful that there are a lot of people in the design industry that really can kind of see our vision and communicate that with other people. So revisiting kind of the toolbox framework, these are all of the things that we did between 2017 and 2022, and that we continue to do, that many of these things have nothing to do with the actual regulation itself, but really kind of can show this menu of options that cities can start taking, or communities can start taking, to, you know, dip their toes into what deconstruction might look like and why it might be important for their community. So hopefully, you know, these kind of ideas can inspire action. That's really one of the big goals of our office, is just to help see this happen more and more across the country, because we're definitely stronger together. And then finally, these are kind of just our core tenets, like big picture, like reuse of buildings and reuse of materials are a form of community resilience. Like they absolutely are. And through kind of the reuse of materials, we're able to foster more community exchange. I always say you can't build a community around the landfill. Like no one's like, let's go out to the landfill and hang out. Like, no. But you know, the exchange of building materials almost harkens back to the idea of like going to your neighbor and asking for a cup of sugar. One of my favorite things that we see with our deconstruction training and really just deconstructions in general is that it's very common for community members who are in these older districts to come up to the deconstruction contractor or the owner and say, hey, I would really like X amount of linear square feet of that siding to fix my own house because it matches mine, right? So those are kind of like the micro circular economies that we really want to see happen. And this is just like the start of that. We also, of course, going back to making sure that these resources are available to people, and then really kind of challenging our take, make, waste system. Single-use plastics, single-use buildings, single-use everything is old, it's boring, it's stupid. Like, let's figure out how we can work together to make it easier for people to reuse, like at a large scale. So this is a really big undertaking, but that's why cities and communities are like the perfect place for this innovation to happen, because cities are networks. And if we can build those networks, these kind of things can happen more and more. And then another one of our core tenets, the landfill doesn't deserve these materials, our communities do. So this is something that continues to drive our work and really keeps us going. And we hope to see it more and more across the country. So that's my high level overview of where we are. Thanks so much for having me. And I'm really happy to answer any questions that you'll have if we have time.